The Nocturne Motel has always been quiet. Too quiet, some would say. Nestled in a forgotten fold of highway between two towns that barely remember its existence, it's the kind of place travelers only stop at when desperation gnaws at their heels, or when the fog rolls in so thick you can't see the hand in front of your face. For me, it was an escape, a sanctuary from the hushed stone halls of the Vatican archives, a place where the weight of ancient secrets felt a little less suffocating. I bought it, refurbished it, made it my own monastic cell, a quiet haven where I could delve into the texts I'd liberated, texts I was never meant to read, never meant to understand. The neon, vacancy, sign above the entrance had been dark for months, the transformer long dead, a planned repair perpetually deferred. That night, the air itself seemed to hum with an unnatural tension. It was late, past midnight, the kind of hour when the world feels thinner, when the veil between what is and what might be frays. I was in my office, a chaotic mess of leather-bound folios and yellowed parchments, translating a particularly cryptic passage from the Scriptura Maledicta, a tome I'd smuggled out, piece by agonizing piece, from a sealed sub-basement within the apostolic library. It spoke of thresholds and the unwoven fabric of reality. Suddenly, a flicker of violent, sickly green light caught my eye through the grimy window. I looked up, my hand hovering over a dog-eared page detailing the voco ignotum, the calling of the unknown. The vacancy sign, dead for so long, pulsed to life, its neon tubes buzzing with an impossible electrical hum. My blood went cold. There was no power running to it. I'd personally cut the wires months ago, anticipating the eventual, costly repair. Yet it glowed, a spectral beacon in the oppressive darkness, casting an eerie emerald sheen across the rain-slicked tarmac. For a moment, my rational mind fought back, scrambling for explanations. A surge, a freak atmospheric phenomenon, a short in the old, buried lines that somehow bypassed the main breaker. But no, the hum was wrong, too deep, too resonant, like a low, sustained chord plucked on a cello made of bone. It vibrated in my chest, not just in the air. I should have turned away. I should have pulled the blinds, locked the doors, and buried myself deeper in my forbidden studies. I should have recognized the warning for what it was. But something in me, that same fatal curiosity that led me to the Scriptura, compelled me to wait, to watch, for a normal guest. The fog began to creep in then, not a gentle drift, but a purposeful, churning cloud that seemed to emerge from the very ground, swallowing the distant highway lights. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic like old blood or ozone after a lightning strike. That's when I saw it, a figure emerging from the heart of the swirling mist at the edge of the parking lot. It wasn't driving a car. It wasn't walking down the road. It simply appeared, as if coalescing from the vapor itself. Tall, gaunt, impossibly still, it began to move towards the office door, its strides long and fluid, yet utterly silent. No crunch of gravel, no whisper of cloth against the rising wind. Nothing. My breath hitched in my throat. I pressed myself against the dusty glass, peering out, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure wore a dark, heavy coat that seemed to absorb what little light the neon sign offered, a broad-brimmed hat casting its face in perpetual shadow. But it wasn't the attire that froze me. It was the way it moved, without purpose yet with inexorable direction. And the eyes. As it drew closer, it tilted its head just so, and for a fleeting, horrifying second, I saw them. They were unblinking, like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. There was no warmth, no flicker of human recognition, just an infinite, ancient void. I felt a primal urge to scream, to run, but my limbs were locked, my voice a useless knot in my throat. This was no normal guest. This was something from the pages of the Scriptura. It reached the office door, standing directly beneath the buzzing vacancy sign, which now seemed to pulse in time with my frantic heartbeat. It didn't knock. It didn't hesitate. The door, which I was certain I'd locked, simply creaked open, as if welcoming it, bowing to its silent presence. It stepped inside, and the temperature in the room dropped several degrees, a sudden, oppressive chill that seeped into my bones. I backed away from the counter, stumbling over a stack of old ledgers, the sound muffled by the sudden roaring in my ears. The figure stood there, radiating an unnatural stillness, an almost perfect vacuum of presence. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound. It just was. Can I help you? I managed, my voice a reedy, pathetic squeak that sounded alien even to myself. The words felt hollow, foolish. Help what? The hat remained low, obscuring its features, but I felt the weight of its unblinking gaze, a pressure that squeezed the air from my lungs. I fumbled for the registration book, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold the pen. The scriptura flashed in my mind, a specific passage from a section titled De Portis Abyssi, concerning the gates of the abyss. They walk among us unseen and unheard, their forms shadows cast by ancient truths. To call them is to invite the silence. To know them is to become known. I had called something. My reading, my relentless pursuit of forbidden knowledge, had been a summoning, a terrible, blasphemous invocation. I pushed the registration book across the counter. It remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, the silence punctuated only by the impossible hum of the neon sign outside. Then, a long, slender finger, pale as bone, extended from beneath the sleeve of the dark coat. It traced a single, unsettling line across the blank page, leaving no ink, no indentation, merely a sensation of profound cold. It was a gesture of refusal, or perhaps a declaration that such mundane rituals were beneath it. Room 7, I whispered, the words tumbling out without my conscious thought, as if compelled by an unseen force. It was the furthest room, the one at the very end of the hall, isolated. The scriptura whispered again, Isolatio est clavis. Isolation is key. The figure turned, its movement still eerily fluid, devoid of the normal stiffness of human joints. It glided towards the hallway leading to the rooms, a shadow-given form. I watched, paralyzed, as it simply passed through the heavy oak door separating the office from the guest corridor. No creak, no latch click, just a shimmering distortion in the wood before it was gone. Gone to room 7. My mind screamed, but my body remained rooted, a monument to my own horrifying culpability. I had opened the gate, I had read the words, I had sought the forbidden, and now the forbidden had sought me. The academic detachment, the intellectual curiosity that had sustained me through years of esoteric research, shattered into a million fragments. This wasn't theoretical, this was real, and it was here, in my motel. I thought I was imagining it when the light in room 7, previously dark, pulsed with that same sickly green hue, matching the vacancy sign. I thought I was losing my mind when the low, resonant hum from outside seemed to emanate directly from that room now, a subtle vibration that thrummed through the very foundations of the building. But I kept listening, kept watching the security monitors, though the feed for room 7 now displayed nothing but static, a blizzard of white noise. The passages from the Scriptura Maledicta echoed in my head, not as abstract law, but as a chilling, precise description of my current reality. The Vatican's centuries of secrecy, their vast, hidden archives, the warnings about texts like the Scriptura, they weren't about protecting humanity from abstract ideas. They were about protecting humanity from this, from the creatures that crawl from the spaces between words. I should have stopped when I first found the Scriptura's fragments in the dusty catacombs beneath the library, disguised as mundane liturgical texts. I should have stopped when my mentor, the venerable Father Anselm, warned me with a look of profound sorrow that some knowledge was a poison, meant to kill the soul, not enlighten it. But I kept reading, driven by a scholar's insatiable hunger for truth, a hunger I now understand was a trap. I thought I was simply translating forgotten languages, uncovering ancient rituals, learning the names of archaic deities. But I was performing a ritual myself, unknowingly, with every word I deciphered, every name I spoke, every ancient invocation I allowed to resonate in my mind. Dominus Umbra, the Lord of Shadows. Voco ignotum. I had called the unknown, and it had answered. It had checked into room 7. Now I sit here, bathed in the anemic glow of my monitor, watching the blank static where room 7 should be, listening to the impossible hum that permeates the very air. My sanctuary has become my prison, my escape my undoing. I'm the proprietor of a hotel that now hosts a guest from beyond the deepest abyss, a guest summoned by my own insatiable, fatal curiosity. And I know, with a chilling certainty that eclipses all fear, that I am merely waiting, trapped, for my own checkout time. The humming from room 7 never truly ceases now, not even when I close my eyes. My inheritance arrived with the sour taste of obligation and a thin, almost apologetic letter from a solicitor I'd never met. This place, this forgotten wing of an older, grander institution, was meant to be my life's quiet denouement, a safe harbor for dusty tomes and fading memories. The air here, even now, always carries the scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and sharp, like ancient blood or ozone. I was meant to be its new archivist, its keeper, its solitary, self-important scholar. I pictured a life of learned peace, quiet contemplation amongst the accumulated knowledge of centuries. How utterly naive I was, how truly, irrevocably ignorant. Among the initial trappings of my new role, amidst the keys that opened only more locked doors and the brittle, yellowed inventories, was the book. It lay on the immense carved desk in my office, as if waiting for me specifically. Bound in what I now suspect was human skin, though at the time I dismissed it as simply an unusually supple, aged leather. It bore no title, only a single, stark relief on its cover, a stylized eye weeping, set within a convoluted, almost organic knotwork. Inside, in flourishing script that was unsettlingly familiar, was my name. Not engraved, not printed, but almost grown into the very fibers of the parchment. It felt personal, like a burden prepared for me alone. This was the rulebook. Its pages were thick, rough, smelling of dust and dried herbs. Most of its edicts were mundane. How to properly catalogue a newly acquired incunabulum, the optimal temperature for the preservation of vellum, the precise mixture of lye and water for cleaning particularly stubborn mildew. But interspersed among these academic minutiae were declarations that made my brow furrow with a mixture of amusement and unease. The sacred incense must be burned at the passing of the longest night, one read. Another, never, under any circumstance, allow a reflection of the east wing's stained glass to fall upon the central altar after the vespers bell. And then, stark and unequivocal, on the very first page, framed by a border of what looked like entwined serpents, Rule 1, never enter room 6 after midnight. I remember a dismissive chuckle escaping me, a puff of superiority. A charming anachronism, I thought, a relic of superstitious times. My intellectual arrogance was, in hindsight, merely a prelude to my downfall. The building itself quickly became a character in my solitary play. It breathed, it groaned, it shifted. The silence, particularly at night, was not empty but thick, resonant, as if holding its breath. Every creak of the ancient timbers, every murmur of the wind through broken panes, echoed with amplified clarity. Room 6, however, was always silent, always locked. Its door, heavier than any other, was unadorned, a plain, dark oak panel without a keyhole or handle. It simply existed, a blank, oppressive space at the end of the longest, darkest corridor on the archive's lowest level. Even in broad daylight, a peculiar chill emanated from its general direction, a damp, subterranean cold that seemed to sink into my bones. I avoided it, not out of fear, but out of a vague, academic disinterest, until that night. It was a Tuesday, I believe, or perhaps a Wednesday. The days blurred into an indistinguishable continuum in that place. I was working late, engrossed in a particularly baffling palimpsest, its undertext hinting at obscure Coptic heresies. The clock on the wall, a gargantuan brass contraption that chimed with a deep, sonorous reverberation, was slowly ticking towards midnight. The air grew perceptibly colder, and a strange, almost physical pressure began to build around me. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly, but it was present. A nagging sense of anticipation, like the moment before a storm breaks. My mind, usually so disciplined, found itself drifting repeatedly to Rule 1, to Room 6. A faint, irrational curiosity began to prickle at me. Just a peek, I thought, to satisfy my rational mind, to prove the old rule a ridiculous absurdity. The clock began its slow, deliberate chimes for midnight. Each strike felt like a hammer blow against the deep, pregnant silence of the archive. Dong, dong, with the 12th echoing clang it was done. And then, from somewhere far away, yet undeniably from the direction of room 6, I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible shuffling sound, like dry leaves being dragged across rough stone or old parchment rubbing against itself. It was quiet, tentative, barely there, but in the profound silence of the hour, it was impossible to ignore. My heart gave a little lurch. A draft, I told myself, or perhaps the pipes settling, nothing more. But the sound persisted. It wasn't the rhythmic groan of old pipes, nor the rustling of leaves. It was too intentional. It began to resolve into something more distinct, a low, barely audible murmur. My dismissive curiosity began to curdle into something else. A prank, my rational mind insisted, trying to regain control. Someone, perhaps a predecessor, leaving a recording to spook the new archivist. I got up, my chair scraping harshly against the stone floor, the sound jarring in the sudden, sharp silence that followed my movement. Drawn by an invisible thread, I walked down the long, cold corridor, my footsteps echoing unnervingly. I stopped before the plain, dark oak door. My hand, despite my conscious will, reached out, pressing my ear against its cold, unyielding surface. The wood felt ancient, impossibly dense. And then I heard it, clearly now, seeping through the impenetrable barrier. The whispers were no longer indistinct. They resolved into distinct voices, multiple, overlapping, yet strangely synchronized. U-News, Duo, Trez. My academic training, my long hours spent poring over ancient texts, immediately recognized the Latin. It was a countdown, a chilling, deliberate countdown. My initial relief, thinking it was merely some old audio loop, perhaps from a forgotten liturgical recording, evaporated in an instant. Because then the voices shifted. They began to interweave with words I didn't recognize, words that were not Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew, not Coptic. GHR, Cathar, Zil, guttural, sibilant, like stones grinding together, yet possessed of a terrifying rhythmic precision. A language I shouldn't know, a language I couldn't know. My blood ran colder than the stone beneath my feet. The texture of these voices was horrifying. Some were impossibly deep, resonating in my chest, a low thrum that spoke of immense subterranean power. Others were reedy, thin, and ancient, like paper-thin whispers from the lips of mummified entities. They were not human voices. They couldn't be. The language was a cacophony of impossible phonemes, yet the underlying structure, the intent of a countdown, remained horrifyingly clear. The sound pressed against my ear, vibrating through the door, through my very bones, making my teeth ache. It felt like a physical assault, a trespass into the most forbidden chambers of my mind. What were they counting down to? What existed on the other side of this door that spoke in such a tongue? This wasn't some quaint, historical anomaly. This was a ritual, a precise, deliberate act being performed on the other side of that locked door. My mind, usually so disciplined, raced through fragmented memories of forbidden books, whispered rumors of the Codex Gigas holding infernal invocations, the apocryphal Pinacotic manuscripts describing entities from beyond the ken of man, the true, unspeakable contents of certain Vatican archives. I was hearing something I was never, ever meant to hear. The true nature of my inheritance, the reason for the rulebook, slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't an archive for knowledge. It was a prison, or perhaps a ward, and I, in my arrogant curiosity, was now complicit. My breath hitched in my throat. My heart began to pound against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird demanding release. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, stinging my eyes. My hands, when I looked at them, were shaking uncontrollably, trembling with a fear more profound than anything I had ever known. The rational part of me screamed to turn and run, to flee this place and never look back. But a terrible, morbid fascination, a scholar's insatiable hunger for the truth, held me captive. I was paralyzed, a voyeur to an unspeakable act, an unwilling listener to a symphony of the damned. I should have stopped when I first heard it. A voice echoed in my mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like my own, laced with a bitter, nascent regret. The counting continued, relentlessly, building in intensity. The voices, though still whispered, grew louder, more urgent, more insistent. They coalesced into a discordant choir, a terrible harmony that scraped against the edges of sanity. It felt like a physical presence, not just sounds, but a pressing weight against the door from the other side. The air in the hallway grew heavy, charged with an invisible electricity, prickling my skin, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was no longer just the fear of what was in room 6, but the dread of what it was doing, what it was birthing. A primal, ancient terror, awakened not by sight, but by sound, burrowed deep into my core. My mind, still grasping for anchors in the escalating madness, conjured images from the darkest corners of human myth and heresy. Names that summoned, sigils that bound. Was this an invocation, a summoning of something from the outer dark, or something far, far worse, an awakening of an entity that had merely slumbered, now stirred to malevolent consciousness by these forbidden incantations? The terrifying possibility solidified. Room 6 wasn't just a room, not merely a storage space. It was a portal, or perhaps a cage barely holding back something utterly inimical to life. And I was standing on its threshold, a foolish moth to a cosmic flame. Final numbers began. The voices became a guttural cacophony, a discordant choir of pure malevolence. The door itself seemed to vibrate, a low, resonant hum emanating from its solid core. The heavy, unseen lock groaned under an unbearable pressure, a sound like tortured metal. The air around me crackled, charged with an immense, terrifying power. Then a final, earth-shattering roar, not from any human throat, but from something vast, ancient, and impossibly deep. And then, as abruptly as it began, silence, a profound, absolute silence that felt heavier, more oppressive than the preceding cacophony. My ears rang with the ghost of the impossible sounds. The air was still, utterly, terrifyingly still, but it was different, tainted. The very fabric of reality seemed to have shifted, irrevocably altered by what had just transpired. I was no longer the naive archivist who had approached the door with a sneer. I was marked. My perception of the world, of the ordered universe, was shattered beyond repair. I stumbled back, my spine scraping against the opposite wall, the cold stone a harsh reminder of my physical existence. The rule was not a suggestion born of superstition. It was a desperate plea, a warning etched in blood and despair. I had broken it. I had, metaphorically speaking, opened the door to something I could never close again. The knowledge of what transpired behind that impenetrable barrier now burned within me, an unholy brand. I understood now. And I was utterly, hopelessly, terrifyingly alone with it. The echoes of those impossible voices still count down in the silence of my mind, and I know they are counting for me. The silence here used to be a comfort. This old rectory, repurposed into a private archive for theological oddities, was my sanctuary. Dust motes dancing in sunbeams, the scent of aged paper and leather, the quiet hum of the ancient HVAC system. These were the constants of my existence, the tranquil backdrop to my increasingly unsettling research into what the Vatican truly hid, what they had deemed too dangerous for the common devout. I spent my days poring over apocryphal texts, Gnostic fragments, and obscure treatises on demonology, feeling safe in the belief that these were mere intellectual exercises, dusty relics of forgotten fears. I should have known better. I should have understood that some doors, once pried open, can never truly be resealed. But I kept reading, driven by a scholastic curiosity that has now curdled into a corrosive dread. It was a Tuesday, I think, or perhaps a Wednesday. Time blurs when your reality begins to fray at the edges. The bell above the heavy oak door chimed, a sound so rare it always startled me. We don't get many walk-ins. Most visitors are scheduled, vetted, pre-approved scholars with credentials as thick as the tomes they wish to consult. But this man, he simply walked in. He had no appointment, no letter of introduction, and most notably, no luggage. Just a threadbare suit that looked a size too small, and a smile that seemed painted on, stretching the corners of his mouth far wider than any human smile should naturally go. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice surprisingly deep, almost resonant given his slight frame. "My name is Silas." He paused, his eyes, which were a peculiar shade of pale, almost silver, fixed on mine. "Silas Blackwood, but please just Silas, remember that." He extended a hand, surprisingly cold, and gripped mine with a strength that felt entirely out of place. Before I could respond, he released it, stepped back, and then repeated himself. Sealers Blackwood. It's important you remember, he then asked without preamble for a room. Just for the night, he added. I have some personal research to conduct, very sensitive. He glanced around the archive, lingering on the shelves behind me, a look of profound recognition in his gaze. I felt a strange prickle of unease. There was something almost desperate in his insistence. I've encountered eccentric scholars before, men and women whose minds were so tangled in esoterica that their social graces often suffered. But this was different. This was an insistence that felt less like an eccentricity and more like a plea, or perhaps a command veiled in civility. He introduced himself a third time as I was filling out the guest ledger, watching my pen move across the page. Sealers Blackwood. Don't forget it, please. It's crucial. My hand hovered over the name field. Something deep inside me, a primal warning bell, screamed at me not to write it, not to commit it to paper, not to give it substance beyond the ephemeral sound of his voice. I ignored the instinct to document everything, a habit ingrained from years of archival work. Instead, I simply wrote guest and drew a blank line where his name should have been. He watched me, his smile never faltering, those silver eyes unreadable. I should have written it down, or perhaps I should have turned him away. He took the key to room 7, the smallest, most unassuming room we had. It felt appropriate for a man with no luggage. I watched him walk down the hall, his footsteps silent on the old Persian runners. He didn't look back. I expected to see him at dinner or perhaps returning to the archive, but he never appeared. A fleeting thought of concern, easily dismissed. He was an adult. He probably preferred solitude or had dined out. It was only the next morning, when the room key was still not returned, that the unease morphed into a cold knot in my stomach. I went to room 7. The door was unlocked. The room was empty, neatly made bed, not a single item disturbed. It was as if no one had ever occupied it. No toothbrushes, no change of clothes, no crumpled receipts, nothing to indicate human presence. Not even a speck of dust disturbed on the bedside table. I checked the guest ledger again, confirming his entry. My guest. This was when I felt the first tremor of true fear. I should have called the police. I should have reported it immediately. But a darker impulse, fueled by my recent dives into prohibited knowledge, urged me to investigate myself. I felt an inexplicable connection between his unsettling arrival and the forbidden lore I was immersing myself in. A rectory is equipped with a modest, vintage security system, mostly to deter opportunistic thieves from our rare collection. There's a camera covering the main hall, another at the front door. I rewound the footage. There he was, clear as day. Sealers Blackwood walking down the hall, turning the knob to room 7 and stepping inside. The timestamp read 9:17 p.m. I watched and waited. Minutes turned into hours. The camera feed showed the empty hall. He never emerged. Not that night, not the next morning. It was impossible. There was only one door, no windows large enough for egress. No secret passages in this section of the building. He simply vanished. My mind, already steeped in the narratives of liminal spaces and esoteric disappearances, immediately began to draw unsettling parallels. I remembered my current research into the Codex Gigas, specifically the annotations regarding unnaming, rituals, and the dangers of uttering certain forgotten appellations. The Vatican, for centuries, maintained an Index Librorum Prohibitorum, not merely to control thought, but to suppress texts that held true, dangerous power. My focus had been on the more mundane theological threats, but I had stumbled upon obscure sections detailing entities that existed purely through memory, through the resonance of their given names. Nomen est omen, the Romans said. A name is an omen, or perhaps a key. My research notes were scattered across my desk, open to pages detailing psychic anchors and the belief in certain cults that an individual's presence could be dissolved or perhaps recast by the deliberate erasure or manipulation of their identity, their name being the primary vessel. I felt a cold wave of understanding wash over me. He asked me to remember his name, not to write it, but to remember it. Had I, by refusing to record it, unknowingly participated in some ritual of effacement, Or conversely, by remembering his name, was I providing him with a continued anchor in this reality, despite his physical absence? The ambiguity was terrifying. I remembered his insistence, his almost frantic plea. Sealers Blackwood, remember that. Had he known what was coming, or was he trying to achieve it? That night, alone in the archive, the silence was no longer a comfort. It was a void waiting to be filled. I heard it first as a faint whisper like the rustle of old leaves, my own name. Marcus. It was soft, hesitant, as if testing the sound. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked up from my book, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing, just the shadows playing tricks, the old building settling. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it as an overactive imagination, a byproduct of too much caffeine and too many hours immersed in unsettling texts. But I couldn't. I heard it again, louder this time, a distinct, deep resonance. Marcus. It was coming from the hall, the empty hall, the one leading to room 7. I told myself it was the wind, perhaps a trick of the acoustics. I even got up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked to the doorway. The hall stretched out, dimly lit, utterly deserted. The air felt heavy, cold, despite the warmth of the room behind me. I stood there, straining my ears, my every nerve ending on high alert. Nothing, just the oppressive silence. I retreated, trying to shake off the creeping dread. But then, as I sat back down, a new sound came. A sigh, long and sorrowful, echoing from the end of the hall, and then once more my name. Marcus. This time it was closer, it was undeniable, it was his voice, the same deep, resonant tone of Sealers Blackwood. I thought I was imagining it, until the whispers became more frequent, more insistent. Sometimes it's just my name. Other times it's a question barely audible, like, do you remember? Or did you forget? Always from the hall, always when no one else is around. I've checked the cameras 100 times. Empty, always empty. I've barricaded room 7, nailed the door shut, but it makes no difference. The voice still reaches me. It calls me by name, a relentless, echoing torment. He said it was crucial to remember his name. And now I can't forget it, even if I wanted to. It's etched into my consciousness, a parasitic memory that feeds on my sanity. The more I try to push it away, the louder his voice becomes. A siren call from a void where a man once stood and then simply ceased to be. I can feel him, a presence that isn't a presence, a weight in the empty spaces. He wanted to be remembered, and now I am his only anchor. His voice is always calling, always just beyond my sight, and I know it will never stop. They come at twilight, just as the last shards of sun bleed from the sky, leaving the world a bruised, purpling canvas. It happens in the narrow space between conscious thought and the creeping numbness that precedes my nightly shift. A shift I no longer remember accepting, only performing. A hand, never quite distinct, always veiled in shadow or an impression of dim light, extends coins. Always a small handful, ancient-looking, with reliefs too worn to decipher, yet weighty and cold to the touch. They clink with a hollow, dead sound as they drop into my palm. A part of me, the last vestige of rational thought, screams to refuse, to recall, to demand explanation. But my fingers, as if guided by an unseen puppeteer, close around them. The transaction is complete. I carry them to the till, a heavy, oak-bound contraption that sits on a polished counter, its surface reflecting the single, flickering gas lamp in the room. This room, too, feels ancient, not just old, but ancient, steeped in the pattern of forgotten ages and unspoken words. I place the coins carefully inside, noting their distinct metallic sheen, the faint, almost imperceptible warmth they radiate for a brief moment before settling back into a deathly chill. My mind, still grappling with the illogic of it all, tries to make sense of the interaction. Perhaps it's a test, a strange initiation into some peculiar society I've unwittingly joined. Maybe it's a dream, a recurring nightmare, a somnambulant ritual. But the cold weight in my hand, the precise clink as they fall, these are too real, too visceral to be mere phantoms of sleep. And then comes the morning, or rather, the moment I peel myself from the damp, heavy sheets that cling to me like grave shrouds. My first instinct every time is to check the till, and every time the results are precisely the same, precisely as horrifying. The coins are gone. Not merely misplaced, not stolen, but utterly, irrevocably gone. Where they lay the night before, there is only the smooth, dark wood of the till's interior. No trace, no residue, not even the faint scent of old metal. They have simply dissolved, melted into nothing like ice in a forge, leaving no puddle, no stain, no evidence of their ever having existed. Yet the till is full, not with my vanished coins, but with a different set, an identical sum perhaps, but undeniably different. Heavier somehow, darker. These coins remain day after day until the next twilight brings the fresh illusion, the new phantom payment. It's as though someone else is paying for my debt or for the services I unwittingly render. The knowledge of these nightly disappearances and phantom replenishments grinds at my sanity. I find myself packing the room in the pre-dawn hours, my breath catching in my throat, a cold sweat beading on my brow. I try to force my hands open, to keep them from accepting the payment, to assert some shred of agency over my own limbs. I clench my fists until my knuckles ache, my fingernails digging crescents into my palms. But when the shadowy figure emerges, when the coins are offered, my hands uncurl as if pulled by invisible strings, by an irresistible primal command. They reach out. They accept. It is a grotesque ballet of capitulation, a testament to a will far stronger than my own, a power that treats my body as a mere automaton. Non sum qui velum est qui debim. I am not who I wish to be, but who I must be. The Latin phrases, fragments of forbidden texts I've spent too many nights poring over, claw at the edges of my thoughts, providing only partial, terrifying answers. And then there are the dreams. They come in jagged, fragmented flashes, not narratives but sensations. The overwhelming metallic taste of iron in my mouth, coating my tongue, filling my throat. It's not the clean, sharp tang of fresh blood, but something deeper, richer, like the taste of ancient rust mixed with something organic and deeply vital. It permeates everything, the air I breathe in the dream, the phantom food I might try to eat, even the sensation of my own skin. It is the taste of something consumed or something given, a price, a toll. I wake with a gasp, my own saliva tasting of it, the lingering metallic aftertaste, a physical manifestation of the invisible debt. What am I paying with? Or, more terrifyingly, what is being paid through me? I remember a passage from one of the Vatican-censored texts, an apocryphal fragment from a supposed lost gospel of Nicodemus, tucked away in the deepest, most secure archives, or perhaps simply fabricated by the very entities it describes. It spoke of transactions beyond the veil, of currencies of intent, of debts levered against the very soul. Eris non sunt est spiritus pretium, not coin, but the price of spirit. I had dismissed it as allegorical, a warning against greed, a metaphor. Now, the cold weight of those melting coins, the forced compliance of my own hands, the iron in my dreams, they all coalesce into a horrifying, concrete reality. The text warned of entities that did not deal in gold or silver, but in the echoes of human will, in the slivers of consciousness, in the very essence of being. They paid in illusions, knowing full well that what was collected was far more substantial, far more devastating. The they who hand me the coins, I never see their faces, not truly. Sometimes a flicker of elongated fingers, unnaturally pale, or the suggestion of eyes that hold not light, but an absence of it. They are less individuals and more manifestations, conduits themselves, perhaps, of a larger, more ancient power. A conspiracy, not of men, but of something fundamentally alien to humanity, weaving its tendrils through the fabric of reality, through our very perceptions. I've read about the Collegium Nocturnum, a supposed shadow order within the church itself, tasked not with preserving knowledge, but with erasing it, with sealing away the names and rituals that could unravel creation. Are these patrons part of that same effort, or are they the very things the Collegium fights against? Or, worst of all, are they one and the same, the guardians becoming the gatekeepers to something far more sinister? I should have stopped when the first coin vanished. I should have fled when the till remained inexplicably full. But I kept reading, kept searching for answers in texts no living soul was meant to comprehend, and now I am bound. My existence is no longer my own. Each night, I am a toll-taker for a phantom road, collecting a payment that dissolves to nothing, a payment for which the true cost is extracted from some deeper, unseen ledger. My dreams are the residue of that extraction, the taste of the iron shackles binding me to this dreadful, unending cycle. I am merely a vessel, a mechanism in a ritual far older than written history, far more insidious than any Vatican conspiracy could ever conjure. And the debt, oh, the debt. It is not mine to pay, but it is mine to collect, and I fear what they are truly collecting through me. I should have stopped when the old archivist's hands trembled, not from age, but from a deeper, more profound fear, as he handed over the Liber Tenebrarum. Its very existence was a blasphemy against the light, a hidden tome whispered about in the deepest, dustiest corners of the Vaticana Secreti Archivum. I dismissed his palpable dread then, a scholarly arrogance gidding my hand, convinced it was merely the superstition of a man steeped too long in arcane lore. Now I understand. He knew. He carried the burden of what was contained within those pages, a weight that settles upon my own shoulders like a shroud woven from dread. This small, desolate motel room, number 3, in a town I can barely recall the name of, has become my confessional, my cell, and very likely my tomb. The room is always cold, a bone-deep chill that no amount of thermostat fiddling can dispel. It's an internal coldness, I think now, a chill that seeped into my very being the moment I began to truly comprehend the nature of the texts. Not the grand, well-documented conspiracies of papal intrigue or forgotten heresies. No, those were mere distractions. What truly mattered, what the Vatican had truly guarded with such ferocity, was the truth of the lacuna, the great void, the gap between realities. These weren't just forbidden books. They were schematics, blueprints for a collapse, an intrusion. I had assumed I was excavating lost knowledge. Instead, I was excavating myself, dismantling the very foundations of my sanity, brick by agonizing brick. The curtains, they're a focal point of this madness. Heavy, faded velvet, the color of dried blood, they've always been drawn tight, shielding the single window. I remember the first time I noticed their unnatural stillness. The motel is old, drafty, yet those curtains never stirred. No breath of air, no settling of the building could disturb their perfect, oppressive drape. It struck me as odd, then a curiosity. My scholar's mind, always seeking the hidden anomaly, fixated on it. What could be so significant about a sealed window that it required such an unmoving, unbreathing barrier? I pulled them back once, just once. It was a moment of weakness, a sudden, desperate craving for a glimpse of the sky, a mundane, star-filled night to ground me after days immersed in the chilling implications of the Codex Ignotus, a companion text to the Liber Tenebrarum. My fingers brushed the fabric, and it felt like cold, damp stone, clammy and strangely resistant. There was a faint tremor, not from my hand, but from the curtain itself, as if it shivered with an internal, agonizing tension. I ignored it, the academic in me overriding the primal flicker of unease. And then I saw it. The window was a portal, or rather, a membrane stretched thin over an abyss. Not stars, not constellations, not even the inky blackness of space. What stretched beyond the glass was an impossible tapestry of shifting, undulating grey-black, shot through with veins of pulsing, phosphorescent green. It crawled. Not like an animal, not like an insect, but with an inherent wrongness, a slow, deliberate movement that defied physics and sanity. It was vast, formless yet structured, like a cancerous growth spanning an infinite expanse, constantly reknitting itself into new, incomprehensible geometries. Tentacles, roots, both and neither. It was the negative space of creation, the antimatter of existence, staring back. The gasp I suppressed was a physical thing, clawing at my throat. My mind, trained for logic and reason, fractured instantly. This wasn't a hallucination. It was too solid, too undeniably there. The sheer, crushing weight of its presence pressed against the glass, a pressure that vibrated through the frame, into my hands, and deep into my bones. This wasn't the sky. This wasn't our world. It was something that pressed its face against the very fabric of reality. A horror contained, barely, by the thin pane of glass in a forgotten motel room. I yanked the curtains closed, a desperate, fumbling act. The velvet felt slimy now, clinging to my fingers. When I finally tore my hand away, a faint reddish-brown stain marred my palm. It wasn't mud, wasn't dust. It had the viscous, metallic scent of old blood, yet it wasn't blood. It wouldn't wash off. It sank into my skin, a permanent mark, a brand, telling me I had crossed a threshold, a limen from which there was no return. The curtains weren't just bleeding. They were weeping the very essence of the thing beyond, a slow, agonizing seepage into our reality, into me. Now the texts have taken on a new, terrifying clarity. The whispers of the old archivist, his fear, it was rooted in knowledge, not superstition. The Vatican wasn't suppressing truth, they were suppressing contact. They understood that some knowledge isn't meant for human comprehension, that some names are not meant to be spoken, even in the privacy of one's own mind. The Liber Tenebrarum spoke of names that summon, not in ritualistic incantations, but in the very act of knowing, of comprehending their impossible forms. Xyloskar, Ignum Tor, Falsum Velum. Each time I read one, each time I felt its alien resonance, I was turning a key, opening a gate. I thought I was simply translating ancient words. I was, in fact, articulating an invocation. My sleep is fractured, haunted by the memory of that crawling firmament, by the faint, rhythmic thrumming that now originates not from the motel's shoddy construction, but from beyond the window. It pulses, a low, deep vibration that resonates in my teeth, in my skull, in the very marrow of my bones. My reflection in the window glass, superimposed over the undulating grey-black, looks less like me each day. The eyes are too wide, the jaw too slack, the fear too absolute. Sometimes I catch glimpses of something else in the reflection, something indistinct, coiling around my own image, a shadow that isn't mine. The stains on my hands have spread, not dramatically, but subtly, like a slow-growing lichen. They pulse now, faintly, a dull, rhythmic throb that mirrors the sound from the window. I am becoming permeable. The barrier between here and there is thinning, not just at the window, but within me. The curtains are no longer just bleeding. They are dissolving, atom by atom, into the other side, or perhaps they are being consumed. The air in the room, once merely cold and stale, is now thick with something alien, a subtle, sweet-sour scent that makes my lungs ache. It's the smell of a world unmaking itself, a reality unraveling at the seams. I should have stopped. I should have burned the books, sealed the archives, fled into the furthest reaches of blissful ignorance. But the pursuit of knowledge, the academic pride, the insatiable hunger for truth, it led me here to this room, to this window, to this impossible view. I thought I was a scholar. I was merely a fool, an unwitting conduit. The truth didn't set me free. It imprisoned me, made me a witness to the undoing of all things. The Vatican knew this. They tried to warn us in their cryptic ways, with their damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory itself. For some things are better left forgotten, lest their very recall summon the thing. But I didn't forget. I remembered. I embraced. And now the thing knows I know. It presses closer. The glass of the window, I swear, flexes inward, imperceptibly yet undeniably. The faint crawling motion I saw before now holds a terrifying certainty, a directedness. I see eyes now, indistinct, formless but there, an aggregation of dark within the greater darkness, focusing on this room, on this pane of glass, on me. The last line of the Liber Tenebrarum, a chilling epilogue etched in a different hand, warned, Qui vidit vita, he who sees is seen. They say ignorance is bliss. I say ignorance is survival. I knew the rules. I documented them, meticulously cross-referencing the cryptic warnings found within the Codex Umbra with the hushed, almost apocryphal addenda provided by the most paranoid of my predecessors. Those who, like me, stumbled too close to the precipice of what should not be known. The Codex was explicit. No reflective surfaces. Never look. Never allow an image of your form to persist, to settle, to take hold in any polished surface, any still pool, any fragment of glass. It wasn't superstition. It was a matter of egress, of pathways, of invitations. It was a practical safeguard, a barrier against entities that exploit the liminal, the interstitial spaces between our world and theirs. And I, in my hubris, in my relentless pursuit of the definitive truth, thought I was above such elementary precautions. It was a lapse. A momentary, catastrophic lapse in judgment, born of exhaustion, perhaps, or a lingering, foolish flicker of what I once was. A small gathering, a rare concession to my former life, a futile, half-hearted attempt to appear normal, to assure the few remaining shadows of my social circle that I was merely preoccupied, not irrevocably broken. Someone, carelessly, thoughtlessly, left a small, irregular shard of what must have been a vanity mirror, perhaps from a broken compact. It lay innocently enough, nestled amidst some forgotten papers on my desk, a casualty of their departure, a forgotten trinket, a glint, a flicker, nothing more than a pinprick of light reflecting the low, sickly glow of my study lamp. But it was enough. My hand, without conscious command, reached out. It was a quick, almost involuntary movement, driven by a primal curiosity I thought I had long since expunged. My thumb and forefinger closed around the cold, surprisingly sharp edge of the glass. Just a glance, I told myself, my own voice a hollow echo in my mind. A quick check of my own weary visage, to see if the pallor had deepened, if the shadows under my eyes were even more pronounced than I imagined. I raised it, not even a full palm-sized piece, to eye level, and there I was, or there he was, my reflection, exactly as I expected. Tired, gaunt, haunted, the eyes too wide, too desperate, the face etched with 1,000 sleepless nights spent poring over forbidden texts, deciphering symbols that claw at the edges of sanity. And then it smiled, before I did. Before the thought of smiling even registered in my own mind, my reflection's lips curled upwards, slowly, deliberately, a private, knowing smirk. It wasn't a sympathetic smile or a mirthful one. It was the smile of a predator, of something that had been waiting, patiently, for a very long time. The blood, or whatever passes for it in this perpetually stressed vessel, ran cold in my veins, my own muscles locked. I wanted to drop the shard, to throw it, to smash it, to obliterate the impossible image, but my hand was frozen. My breath caught, trapped somewhere between my lungs and my throat, a silent scream clawing for release. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the visual impossibility with the stark reality of what I was witnessing. And then I heard it, not with my ears, not exactly. It was a voice that resonated in the hollow spaces behind my eyes, in the very marrow of my bones. A dry, rasping whisper, like parched papyrus unfolding in a forgotten crypt, or the rustle of ancient robes in a dark corridor. "You look tired," it purred, its reflected eyes glinting with an unholy amusement that was utterly alien. "So very tired, Codex." It knew my name. Not just my moniker, not merely the title I'd adopted to distance myself from the man I once was, but the weight of it, the burden of the knowledge I carry, the profound exhaustion that permeates my very being. "It would be so easy," it continued, the smile widening just a fraction more, revealing teeth that seemed sharper, more numerous than my own, a ghastly parody of my own dental structure. "So simple to let me step through, to let me take the burden, to let you rest." How long? That was the question that screamed silently in the echoing vault of my skull, drowning out the insidious whisper, yet simultaneously amplifying its terror. How long had it been there? How long had this entity, this mimic, this parasitic echo, been observing me, learning my mannerisms, anticipating my thoughts, waiting for this singular, catastrophic lapse? Had it been there since the beginning, since I first cracked the binding of the Codex Umbra, since I began charting the forbidden geometries, the abyssal chronologies? Was it not merely an image of myself, a fleeting optical illusion, but a distinct entity, held at bay only by the rigid, unwavering enforcement of my rules? The revelation was a gut punch, a betrayal by my own supposed reflection. I thought I was simply avoiding a potential breach, not that the breach itself had been patiently biding its time in plain sight. The Vatican had their prohibitions for a reason. The ancient rites of dissimulation, the warnings against reflective surfaces found in fragments of the Liber Obscura, they weren't quaint superstitions for the simple-minded or arbitrary theological dogma. They were practical safeguards against the very fabric of reality unraveling, against the insidious creep of things from beyond. The names I had inadvertently memorized, the sigils I had sketched in my notebooks, the echoes of forgotten tongues, Tenebris invocatio, speculum malignum. Had these merely weakened the veil around me? Was my reflection a natural predator drawn to the scent of my forbidden knowledge, to the esoteric energies my studies had undoubtedly stirred, or something far more sinister? A manifestation of the very things I had sought to contain, a personalized horror tailored specifically for me, for my unique vulnerabilities. I screamed then, a raw, primal sound ripped from my throat, a desperate release of the terror that had seized me. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I hurled the shard. It struck the ancient, unforgiving stone wall of my study with a sharp, brittle crack, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces, each fragment reflecting only the dim, accusing light of the lamp. But the image, the smile, the whisper, they lingered. They etched themselves onto the inside of my eyelids, into the deepest crevices of my memory, a perpetual brand. Now, every surface, every polished stone, every drop of dew on the windowpin, every accidental glimpse of water in the basin holds the potential for that insidious glint. I see shadows move in the periphery of my vision, convinced that the me on the other side is no longer merely an echo, but an active, patient sentinel. It knows I am tired. It knows I am weak. And it knows I'm not entirely sure which face is truly mine anymore. Is the original still here, or did the mimic already claim something vital, something elemental, something irreplaceable, without me even knowing? It's waiting for me to agree, and I can feel myself slipping. I should have stopped when I first deciphered the marginalia in the Codex Tenebrarum, those faint, almost imperceptible Latin annotations that seemed to bleed through the vellum from some forgotten, more terrible text. They spoke of residua animi, not as echoes or memories, but as tangible, lingering presences, tethered to the very fabric of existence by the intensity of their final moments. I was a scholar, driven by an insatiable curiosity for the occult, for the hidden mechanisms of the divine and the profane. The Vatican's guarded archives, whispered about in hushed tones among a select few, were not merely repositories of history, but vast mausoleums of suppressed truth. I believed myself immune, inoculated by decades of detached academic pursuit, but detachment is a luxury afforded only to the ignorant. The texts weren't merely descriptive, they were prescriptive, a terrifying instruction manual for a reality I now find myself irrevocably entangled in. I kept reading, of course, because that's what one does when faced with the tantalizing precipice of forbidden knowledge. I pursued the cross-references, the cryptic symbols that hinted at a system, a clandestine accounting of these residua. It led me down dusty corridors of forgotten monasteries, into the private collections of disgraced ecclesiastics, and eventually to a series of obscure texts, an almost heretical subset of liturgical writings known as the Liber Tabularum Animarum. This was no mere spiritual treatise. It was a ledger, an inventory of what happened when souls, or fragments thereof, refused to transition. It outlined the concept of occupation points, specific locales or vessels that could host these lingering presences. And most chillingly, it detailed a process of accumulatio, a slow, inexorable buildup of these entities in a finite number of predetermined spaces, a kind of existential overflowing. The dread began subtly, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere of my study. A sudden chill, even on a warm day that wasn't from a draft. A faint, almost musical hum from the old floorboards when no one was moving upstairs. I dismissed it as overactive imagination, a natural consequence of immersing oneself in such grim material. But then, the keys started moving. I'd leave the set for my office on the counter, only to find them slid an inch or two across the polished wood, always in the direction of the front door. Not fallen, not jostled, but deliberately pushed. I thought it was the cat, but the cat was often asleep on my lap when it happened, an innocent, purring alibi. I started marking the position of the keys with a pencil. Each morning, the tiny line would be a 1/4 inch, sometimes a 1/2 inch, away from the brass. It was a silent, persistent testament to an unseen force. Then came the doors. Not the main entry, but the internal doors of the house, particularly those leading to rooms that were rarely used. I'd wake at dawn, the first hint of grey light painting the window panes, and hear a soft click, the distinct sound of a latch disengaging. I'd creep out, heart pounding, expecting an intruder, but find nothing. The doors would be open, just a fraction, sometimes wider, revealing the shadowed interiors of unused guest rooms, empty to the naked eye. But I knew, with a horrifying certainty born of the liber tabularum, that they were not. The air within these rooms felt denser, colder, somehow pressurized. There was a subtle indentation on the pillows, as if someone had just risen from a prolonged rest, a faint, lingering scent that wasn't dust or old wood, but something metallic and faintly sweet, like ozone and dried blood. I thought I was imagining it until I started setting up crude sensors. Tripwires of fine thread, microscopic cameras trained on the doors, motion detectors that chirped silently to a hidden receiver. The cameras captured nothing, the tripwires remained undisturbed. But the motion detectors did register activity. Faint, erratic pulses in the deepest hours of the night, originating from within the empty rooms. The patterns were not random. They were slow, deliberate, like someone shifting in bed, sighing, or running a spectral hand over the cold glass of a windowpane. The readings from my thermal imaging camera, a recent, desperate acquisition, were even more disturbing. Faint, localized cold spots would drift through the rooms, hovering near the mattress, settling by the vent, moving with an eerie, sluggish intelligence. It wasn't just residual energy. It was a residual presence, and it was occupying the space. The liber tabularum specified 10 such occupation points within a given locus, a consecrated or otherwise energetically charged area. My home, once a seminary annex, had unknowingly become such a locus. And each time a key shifted, each time a door opened, I knew another room was being occupied. The book spoke of a threshold, limen decem, the 10th point. When all 10 spaces were full, the accumulation reached a critical mass, and the nature of the locus itself would change. It would no longer be a place of temporary habitation, but a permanent, self-sustaining nexus, a breach in the veil. And the occupants would no longer be mere residua. They would achieve a terrifying, localized sentience, drawn together by the sheer force of their aggregated presence. They would become an omnium congregatum. I started numbering the rooms, ticking them off on a mental list, a desperate, futile attempt to exert control over the encroaching horror. First, the old nursery, then the guest room, the small study by the attic, the unused pantry. 6, 7, 8. Each one now felt distinctly different, heavy with an unseen weight, permeated by a specific, chilling vibration. I could almost hear the faint, rattling sigh from the vents, the creak of an empty floorboard, the barely audible whisper of a name I didn't recognize, carried on a breeze that didn't exist. My own name sometimes, or names from the codex, names that could summon, names that could bind. The thought that I, in my blind pursuit of knowledge, had inadvertently opened my home, my sanctuary, to this slow, insidious infestation, filled me with a cold, paralyzing terror. I was the gatekeeper, and I had left the gate ajar. Now, as the faint, metallic scent grows stronger, and the keys move with an almost frantic urgency across the counter each morning, I can feel the pressure mounting. There are only 2 rooms left. The liber tabularum holds no answers for what happens after the 10th room is filled, only cryptic warnings of a reversion and an opening of the inner eye. I don't want my inner eye opened to whatever monstrosity emerges from the omnium congregatum. I hear the soft creak of the hinge from the spare room, the 9th door just now. My heart is a frantic drum against my ribs. I'm running out of places to hide, not just in this house, but in my own mind. The accumulation is almost complete. I read the books, and now the books read me. The weight of the book in my hands is a familiar, oppressive comfort, or it was until last night. I've spent years poring over these pages, this compendium of things no sane mind should ever truly comprehend. Each entry a whispered secret, each diagram a key to a lock that should have remained sealed. I've always treated it as an artifact, a relic, something with a history, but a static history. It wasn't meant to change. It was supposed to be a guide, a map through the labyrinthine truths of the esoteric, not a living, evolving entity bent on my dissolution. The binding, a dark, thick leather, has always felt ancient beneath my fingertips, dry and crackled like parchment. But last night, as I turned to the back, to the blank pages I had always considered the book's definitive end, it creaked. Not the soft, groaning protest of old leather, but a sound like fresh skin stretching, supple and unnervingly new. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my chest. The last few pages, previously pristine, seemed to shift to absorb the ambient light. And then I saw it. A new rule. It hadn't been there before, I swear it. This isn't the first time I've had reason to doubt my memory, to question the reliability of my own perceptions in the face of the unspeakable things I've witnessed. But this was different. This was a direct assault on the very fabric of my reality. The ink, a deep, unsettling crimson, appeared to bleed slightly at the edges, as if freshly applied, still wet. It read in stark, unforgiving script, "Do not forget who you are." The words themselves, simple enough, struck me with the force of a physical blow. But it was the marginalia that truly shattered my composure. Around that terrible new commandment, scribbled in a frantic, almost desperate hand, were my own notes. My distinctive loops, my precise slant, the way I always form my R's. It was undeniably my handwriting. It spoke of desperate struggles, of fragmented thoughts, of names half recalled, and then deliberately obscured. Latin phrases intertwined with archaic English, warnings against the blurring, the dissolution of the unique self. There were even what appeared to be fragmented incantations, spells designed to bind or perhaps to recall identity. Yet, despite the undeniable familiarity of the script, I possessed not a single memory of writing any of it, not a flicker of recollection. It was as if another version of me, one existing in a temporal space just beyond my reach, had taken up the pen, leaving behind a dire message I was meant to discover. I should have stopped then, the tremor in my hand a warning, the chill seeping into my bones an omen. But I kept reading, or rather, rereading, tracing the familiar curves of my own script, searching for a memory that simply wasn't there. This book, this accursed compendium I had foolishly believed I was master of, had become something else entirely. It wasn't just a record of forbidden knowledge. It was a participant, a sentient entity perhaps, or a conduit for one, actively dictating new terms, adding new pages to my dwindling existence. Do not forget who you are. The command echoed in the hollow chambers of my mind, a chilling premonition. Why this specific instruction? What precisely does it mean to forget who you are in the context of these eldritch rules? And what are the consequences? The fear, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the back of my neck, sliding down my spine like icy talons. This wasn't merely about losing my memories. It was about something far more insidious. It was about erasure, about replacement. The Vatican archives, those dark labyrinths I once plundered with such academic zeal, suddenly seemed less like a source of forbidden knowledge and more like an instruction manual for my own dissolution. I recall fleeting references in some of the more obscure grimoires, the ones kept under lead and blessed with every conceivable ward, to entities that covet identity, beings that cannot manifest without a host, or rather, without wearing a host's name, their very essence. The old texts hinted at a dreadful practice, a spiritual identity theft, where a vacant name becomes an open invitation. Nomen est omen, they used to say. The name is an omen, a destiny, a very binding. If a name is forgotten, if the vessel bearing it becomes hollow, then the very fabric of its existence frays, offering passage to whatever lurks beyond the veil. This new rule, written in my own hand yet alien to my memory, feels like a final desperate plea from a self already teetering on the precipice of oblivion. I find myself staring at my reflection in the polished surface of my desk, a nervous habit I've developed since the words appeared. Do my eyes still hold the same conviction? Does the line of my jaw retain its familiar stubbornness? I try to recite my full name aloud, slowly, deliberately, as if performing an exorcism. Dr. Alistair Codex. The words feel hollow, like an echo in a deserted chamber. It's a name I've carried for decades, a label I've worn with a certain academic pride, a badge of a life dedicated to uncovering the very truths that now threaten to consume me. But now, it feels less like a part of me and more like a signpost someone else could follow, a vacant lot someone else could build upon. My mind, usually a fortress of facts and meticulously catalogued horrors, now feels like a sieve, leaking precious droplets of self. I thought I was imagining it at first, the creeping tendrils of amnesia, the subtle shifts in my own history. A conversation I couldn't quite recall, a book I swore I'd read suddenly unfamiliar. But now, with this fresh inscription in my book, in my handwriting, the truth is undeniable. The process has begun. The question echoes with chilling clarity in the confines of my study, in the echoing silence of a world that remains oblivious to the horrors I now face alone. If I forget my name, who or what will check in under it? It's not a rhetorical question. It's a terrifyingly literal one. The implications are staggering, a nightmare scenario plucked straight from the most ancient, forbidden texts I've ever dared to consult. These entities, these parasitic consciousnesses, they don't simply possess, they replace. They don't just inhabit, they overwrite. And they do so with a terrifying finesse, leaving no trace but the subtle, insidious shift in the host's personality, the slight vacancy in their gaze, the faint, lingering scent of something other. The rules, I realize, aren't just for me. They are for it. For whatever entity is waiting, patiently observing my decline, ready to slip into the vacant space I leave behind. Qui sum ego. Who am I, truly, if my own memory is a traitor, if my own hand can write secrets it then withholds from me? The concept of a soul, a unique spirit, suddenly feels like a flimsy garment, easily shed, easily stolen. The dread tightens its grip, constricting my breath. I'm being hunted, not by an external force, not by a shadowy organization, but by the very erosion of my identity. The book lies open on the table, the crimson words a beacon of my encroaching doom. Each passing hour feels like a grain of sand slipping through my fingers, each forgotten detail a step closer to relinquishing my claim to myself. I clutch at fragments of memory, desperate to anchor myself to something, anything, solid. My childhood home, the scent of pipe tobacco, the taste of cheap port in a dusty library. But even those recollections feel brittle, like old photographs fading under harsh light. The book demands I remember, but it also, subtly, seems to be erasing the very things I need to hold onto. It's a cruel, insidious trap, and I walked right into it, driven by an insatiable curiosity for the forbidden. My fingers trace the jagged lines of my forgotten script, the lines that now spell out my personal damnation. It is a testament, a diary of a future self screaming a warning to a past self who cannot hear, or perhaps, cannot understand the true depth of the danger. The leather cover feels like a living thing against my palm, pulsing faintly, thrumming with an energy that wasn't there before. It feels as if the book itself is drinking my memories, siphoning off my identity, page by terrifying page. I cannot escape it. It is bound to me now, a parasitic twin feeding on the very essence of who I am. And the terror is not just of what I will become, but of the realization that some part of me, some fragmented self, already knows the answer to that dreadful question. I am a stranger in my own mind, and the walls are crumbling fast. I remember the chill, a persistent cold that clung to my bones long after I'd left the drafty, forgotten corners of the archive. It wasn't the kind of cold that a woolen blanket or a roaring fire could banish. It was the internal kind, a profound spiritual hypothermia that began the moment I first laid my eyes on the Codex Umbrarum, the forbidden text tucked away in a sub-basement of the Vatican Library, a room that wasn't even supposed to exist. I should have stopped then, when the ink seemed to writhe on the page, when the Latin shifted and reformed itself before my very eyes, revealing truths no mortal was ever meant to comprehend. But I kept reading. I was a fool, intoxicated by the promise of ultimate knowledge, by the whispers of names that could unmake the world. I thought I was simply transcribing, cataloguing, a scholar delving into forgotten lore. I thought I was immune. The exhaustion, that's what truly broke me. It wasn't just the sleepless nights spent deciphering archaic scripts, tracing symbols that felt like brands against my fingertips. It was the constant, low thrum of dread, the feeling of being watched, of something pressing against the fragile walls of reality. Every shadow seemed to deepen, every creak in the old building became a footstep, a breath. My mind, once a finely tuned instrument of logic and reason, had become a sieve, letting sanity drain away in a slow, agonizing trickle. I was always tired, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest could alleviate. It felt less like sleep deprivation and more like my very essence was being siphoned, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell. I knew in the darkest recesses of my fractured mind that the relentless pursuit of the Liber Maleficarum and the subsequent translation of those unholy verses had fundamentally altered me, leaving me open, exposed. And then, one evening, it happened. Not with a dramatic flash or a booming voice, but with a subtle shift in the air, a scent that prickled the hairs on my arms. I was in my study, surrounded by my own meticulously indexed collection of occult literature, the very instruments of my downfall, when the wall where the forgotten Room 6 was supposed to be, the room the architects assured me had been bricked up centuries ago, shimmered. Not a visual distortion, but a sense, an intuitive understanding that the solid masonry was no longer solid. A line, invisible yet undeniable, appeared, defining a door where none should exist. There was no handle, no hinges, just an outline, almost a suggestion. And from behind it, the smell. Oh, the smell. It was sweet, sickeningly so, like overripe fruit left to rot in the summer sun, or 1,000 lilies wilting in a stagnant pool. But beneath that cloying sweetness was something else, something fetid and metallic, like old blood mixed with putrefaction, the odor of death trying to masquerade as life. It was a contradiction that assaulted my senses, making my stomach churn even as a strange curiosity, a morbid fascination, pulled me closer. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent and a palpable hum, like a distant, distorted choir. It felt like a trap, yes, but a trap laid with such meticulous precision that I could almost appreciate its craftsmanship, even as it consumed me. I knew, with the certainty of a drowning man recognizing the current, that this was the culmination of my journey. This was the next step, the inevitable consequence of peering too deeply into the abyss. The door opened without a sound, simply receding into itself like water. The light inside was dim, a sickly yellow-green glow that emanated from no discernible source, casting long, wavering shadows. And there they were, a gathering. They sat around a long, polished table, a strange, antique thing that seemed to drink the light. And the faces, Deus Muse, the faces, they were stitched. Not literally, not with thread and needle in a crude, visible way, but figuratively, as if composed of fragments, parts taken from different people, different times, and then crudely reassembled. I recognized some of them. Or rather, I recognized features. The gaunt cheekbones of the old priest who had first introduced me to the notion of the Vaticanus Secretus archives. The piercing eyes of the librarian who had warned me away from the restricted section. The precise, thin lips of the scholar whose translation of the Testament of Carnemagos I had dismissed as pure fiction. They were all there, or pieces of them were, amalgamated into these horrific, composite beings. Their skin was taut, a waxy pallor, and their eyes, though they tracked me, seemed to possess no depth, only a flat, terrifying knowing. They didn't speak, not with words at least, but a chorus of thoughts, or perhaps a single, resonant understanding, filled the room, pressing against my skull. "Welcome. We have been expecting you." One of them, a figure whose face was a patchwork of a benevolent old woman and a stern cardinal, gestured to the only empty chair at the table. It was perfectly positioned, directly opposite where I stood, a single antique wooden chair, polished smooth, its surface seeming to gleam with malevolent invitation. They pulled it back for me, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of infinite patience and an unbreakable certainty. "You belong here," the silent chorus insisted. "You have earned your place." The implication was clear. I wasn't just a guest. I was one of them now, or soon to be. I should have run. I should have screamed, fought, clawed my way back into the familiar, if fadding, reality of my study. But I couldn't. The exhaustion had finally consumed me, leaving nothing but a hollow vessel. Every muscle in my body felt heavy, my limbs like lead. The mental fortitude I once possessed had eroded, replaced by a profound sense of resignation. The fight had been drained out of me over months, years, by the creeping tendrils of dread, by the constant pressure of knowledge that was too vast, too terrible for a mortal mind to hold. I was so tired, so utterly, irrevocably weary. And so I walked forward. I sat down. The wood of the chair was surprisingly warm beneath my fingers, almost welcoming. It felt like coming home after a long, arduous journey, a twisted, macabre homecoming I had unknowingly been destined for. As I settled into the chair, the composite faces around the table seemed to shift, their borrowed features morphing slightly, as if their collective gaze was sharpening, focusing on me with a dreadful intensity. And then it started. Not a voice, but a cascade of intrusive thoughts, images, memories, all mine, yet viewed through their alien, cold perception. They knew everything. My earliest childhood fears, the secret shame I carried from an insignificant transgression years ago, the hidden doubts about my faith, the moments of weakness and cruelty I thought I had buried. But it wasn't just the mundane secrets, the everyday human failings. They knew the deeper, darker truths. They knew about the night I first spoke the name, not out loud, but in the deepest silence of my mind, a name whispered in the forgotten footnotes of the Liber Tenebrarum. They knew the precise moment I understood the true meaning of the Vatican's concealed archives, not as a repository of knowledge, but as a prison for things that should never see the light of day. They knew the heresy I had allowed to bloom in my heart, the terrible conviction that God had abandoned us to the cosmic horrors hinted at in the forgotten Apocrypha. They knew I had sought not just knowledge, but power, a way to control the shadows I was so desperately trying to understand. They knew my intent, my hubris. They knew the exact paragraph in the De Profundis Umbri where I realized the true nature of their existence, the genius loci that wasn't bound to a place, but to the very concept of forbidden knowledge itself. They knew the fear I felt, but also the strange, perverse thrill that came with it. They understood my hunger, and in knowing, they claimed me. Their knowledge was not an invasion, it was an embrace, pulling me into their collective consciousness, stripping away the last vestiges of my individuality. I was no longer an observer, I was a participant. The circle was complete. I sit here now at their table, a guest among the eternally present, and I understand. I am not simply tired. I am hollowed, my essence consumed, my mind a newly stitched component in their terrifying, perpetual gathering. I should have known that the most profound secrets always demand the highest price. The ink on the rulebook's pages has begun to retreat, a subtle, creeping fade that started in the margins and now devours entire paragraphs. It's not just bleaching, it's an erasure, as if the very words are deciding they were never meant to be read, never meant to exist in the first place. I sit here, my fingers tracing the phantom impressions of warnings I once held so tightly, warnings that now ghost beneath my touch like forgotten dreams. The paper itself feels thinner, less substantial, as if it too is slowly unraveling from this plane. I recall, with a sickening lurch in my gut, the detailed schematics of the motel's internal architecture I once saw, the cryptic guest manifest, the precise instructions on how to manage the anomaly in room 7. All gone, replaced by the off-white blankness of paper that has simply decided not to be. The only rule that still clings, albeit weakly, is the one emblazoned across what was once the final page, stark against the encroaching void. Do not stay forever. It hangs there, a taunt more than a command, a cruel joke etched into my mind long after its physical manifestation has begun to blur. I try to remember the precise wording that followed, the caveats, the escape clauses. Was there a time limit, a ritual for egress? My mind is a sieve, and the longer I gaze at that fadding script, the more the surrounding information slips through, leaving me with only the skeletal framework of dread. It's an insidious form of censorship, not by external hand, but by the object itself, deciding what information is fit for retention. And I, it seems, am not fit to retain the most critical parts. I don't remember when I last left the property. The thought is a dull ache, a phantom limb of memory. Was it weeks ago? Months? Time here, within the embrace of the Blackwood Motel, has become a viscous, shapeless thing. It stretches and contracts, moments bleeding into hours, days into an indistinguishable continuum. The outside world feels like a rumor, a distant echo from a life I'm no longer certain I ever inhabited. I look out the window at the perpetually twilight landscape, the twisted pines, the same empty stretch of highway. It's always the same, always waiting. I have tried, of course. In the beginning, I tried to leave. The car keys would vanish, the tires would mysteriously deflate, or the old Chevrolet would simply refuse to start, coughing a mournful protest that seemed to carry a strange, knowing intelligence. Now the thought itself feels foreign, like trying to remember the name of a forgotten deity. Why would I leave? There is only here. The neon sign, Blackwood Motel, flickers beyond my control. I used to be able to dictate its tempo, its color, even the phrases it scrolled in incandescent green or baleful crimson. Now it pulses with an agenda entirely its own. Sometimes it's a slow, inviting glow beckoning unseen travelers. Other times it spasms violently, a frantic, almost desperate rhythm that suggests distress or perhaps hunger. And it welcomes more than humans. I see them in the periphery, in the distorted reflections on the polished lobby floor, in the sudden elongations of shadows cast by the vending machine. Things that slide rather than walk, that shimmer rather than stand solid. They never quite resolve into focus, never present a coherent form, but their presence is a crushing weight in the air, a metallic tang on the tongue. I hear the phantom jingle of keys, the creak of doors opening and closing in rooms I know are empty, the murmur of voices that are too deep, too guttural to be human. They are the clientele, I suppose, the ones the rulebook was meant to regulate, to placate. And now, without the rules, without the structure, they simply are. They fill the spaces, not physically, but spiritually, psychically. They are the dust motes dancing in the motel's perpetual twilight, the chill that clings to your bones even in the warmth of the sun. I've started leaving out bowls of water, or sometimes a single, pristine white lily, a desperate attempt at appeasement, a vestige of ancient customs I vaguely recall from some forgotten academic text on folklore and the fae. Genii locorum, I murmur to myself, the spirits of the place. But these are no benevolent sprites. These are something older, hungrier. I should have stopped when I found the first footnote in the margin of the rulebook, scribbled in a hand distinct from the main text, referencing an obscure Vatican codex. Liber Tenebrarum, it read, the Book of Shadows. I thought it was a charming piece of theatrical flair, a clever embellishment for a strange, anachronistic relic. But I kept reading, tracing the intricate symbols, deciphering the crude Latin that spoke of threshold guardians and eternal guests. It detailed not just rules for a motel, but instructions for maintaining a transdimensional nexus, a place where the veil between worlds was not merely thin, but torn, frayed. I thought I was imagining it until the shadows started stretching in ways no light source could explain, until the whispers weren't just in my head, but seemed to emanate from the very drywall. The text spoke of names that summon. I recall a particular passage describing the true name of the establishment, not Blackwood Motel, but something guttural, a series of clicks and sibilant hisses, a name that tasted of metal and ancient earth. I'd laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound, and then, in a moment of reckless academic curiosity, I'd attempted to pronounce it. The air had solidified around me, the lights had gone out, and I remember a sudden, profound emptiness, followed by an equally profound fullness, as if something vast and ancient had exhaled and then inhaled me. That was when the rulebook truly began its fade. That was when I realized the rules were not for me to follow, but for me to maintain. And by trying to understand them, I had breached them. By speaking the name, I had ratified my contract. The rules were a cage, not for the motel, but for me. They were the instructions on how to tend the trap. And in my hubris, in my academic zeal to catalogue and decipher, I had meticulously disassembled my own prison, brick by invisible brick. The faded rule, do not stay forever, isn't a warning to me from some prior caretaker. It's the motel's own ancient decree. It doesn't want guests forever, it wants parts forever. It wants you forever. And I, fool that I was, offered myself as the final, willing ingredient. If the motel wants me as its final guest, as the permanent fixture, the living heart of its desolate empire, how do I check out? There is no counter, no bell to ring, no concierge to appeal to. The ledger is blank, the keys are formless whispers in the wind. The fadding rulebook, now almost entirely clear, seems to mock me. It wasn't a manual for operating the motel. It was the blueprint for my assimilation. Verbum caro factum est, I whisper, the word made flesh. And I, it seems, am becoming the word, becoming the motel, becoming the silence. I feel the faint, rhythmic thrumming in the floorboards beneath my feet, a heartbeat that is not my own.